In the mist-shrouded valleys of medieval Europe, where the thunder of hooves could spell either salvation or doom, one morning would witness an event so extraordinary that chroniclers would struggle to believe their own accounts. Picture this: 500 mounted knights, their armor glinting in the pale dawn light, preparing to face an army 100 times their size. Not in a desperate last stand, not in a hopeless charge against impossible odds, but in a calculated strike that would turn the very foundations of medieval warfare on their head. This is not a tale of fantasy or legend. This is the story of how tactical brilliance, perfect timing, and the devastating power of surprise could transform a handful of warriors into an unstoppable force. A story that would echo through the halls of castles and the pages of military treatises for centuries to come. The year was 1347, and the political landscape of Europe writhed like a living thing, constantly shifting alliances and bitter rivalries carving new boundaries with each passing season. In the heart of what would become modern-day France, two great powers stood locked in a deadly dance of conquest and revenge. The larger force, a massive army of 50,000 men, represented the combined might of three allied duchies. Their banners stretched across the countryside like a multicolored sea, their supply trains snaking behind them for miles. At the head of this vast host rode Duke Aldric the Bold, a man whose reputation for crushing his enemies was matched only by his appetite for conquest. His army was a fearsome sight to behold. Ranks upon ranks of heavily armored infantry marched in perfect formation, their spears creating a forest of steel points that caught the morning sunday. Crossbowmen walked alongside, their weapons slung across their backs, quivers bristling with bolts capable of punching through mail at 300 paces. Siege engines rumbled on great wooden wheels, their massive frames promising destruction to any castle foolish enough to resist. But it was the cavalry that truly marked this as an army of conquest. Nearly 8,000 mounted warriors rode in disciplined columns, their war horses bred for battle, their lances held high with colorful pennants streaming in the wind. These were not mere soldiers, but the flower of noble houses, each knight worth a dozen common foot soldiers in both training and equipment. Duke Aldric had every reason to be confident. His intelligence network had confirmed that his enemy, Duke Roderick of Montclair, commanded barely 10,000 men total. The mathematics of medieval warfare were brutal but simple. Superior numbers, better equipment, and experienced leadership almost always guaranteed victory. Aldric's army outnumbered his foe 5-1. In his mind, this campaign would be over before the first snows of winter. What Duke Aldric did not know was that Duke Roderick had no intention of meeting him in open battle. While Aldric's massive army lumbered through the countryside, consuming supplies like a plague of locusts, a very different kind of preparation was taking place in the shadowed valleys ahead. Duke Roderick was cut from different cloth than his opponent. Where Aldric relied on overwhelming force, Roderick was a student of subtlety. He understood that in warfare, as in hunting, the patient predator often brings down prey many times its size. His war council had studied every map, every path, every stream and ridge for 50 miles in every direction. They knew this land as intimately as a lover knows their beloved's face. The plan that emerged from those long nights of planning was audacious beyond measure. Roderick would not hide behind castle walls or retreat to more favorable ground. Instead, he would do something that violated every principle of medieval military doctrine. He would attack. But this would not be a conventional assault. Roderick had handpicked 500 of his finest knights, men whose skill in the saddle was matched only by their absolute loyalty to their duke. These were not young hotbloods seeking glory, but seasoned veterans who understood that this mission would likely be their last. Each had been chosen not just for his prowess with sword and lance, but for his ability to follow orders without question, to maintain perfect silence when silence meant life or death. The weapons these knights carried had been selected with meticulous care. Their lances were not the tournament weapons of courtly competition, but war lances, shorter and heavier, designed to punch through armor and shatter bone. Their swords were battle-tested blades, many of them family heirlooms that had tasted blood in a dozen campaigns. But perhaps most importantly, each knight carried a crossbow, a weapon that many nobles still considered beneath their station, but whose effectiveness against armor could not be denied. The horses, too, were special. These were not the massive destriers of ceremonial processions, but smaller, more agile coursers bred for speed and endurance. They had been trained to respond to the slightest pressure from knee or heel, to wheel and charge on command, to remain steady in the chaos of battle. Each animal represented years of careful breeding and training, a fortune in horseflesh that Roderick was prepared to gamble on a single throw of the dice. For 3 days, as Duke Aldric's army advanced through the rolling countryside, these 500 knights moved like ghosts through the landscape. They traveled only at night, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. During the day, they sheltered in hidden valleys and abandoned barns, their scouts keeping constant watch on the enemy's progress. The location Roderick had chosen for his ambush was a stroke of tactical genius. The Valley of Thornwood lay directly on Aldric's route of march, a natural bottleneck where the main road passed between steep, forested hills. For most of the year, it was simply another stretch of countryside, unremarkable except for the small stream that ran alongside the road. But Roderick and his war council had identified something that would prove crucial. The morning mists that rose from the water would provide perfect cover for an attacking force positioned on the surrounding slopes. On the evening before the ambush, as Duke Aldric's army made camp just 5 miles away, Roderick's knights took their positions. Moving with the silence of practiced hunters, they climbed the wooded hills that overlooked the valley. Each group of 50 knights was assigned a specific section of the slope, their positions carefully calculated to create overlapping fields of fire when the moment came to strike. The night seemed endless. Knights crouched in the cold darkness, checking and rechecking their equipment. Bowstrings were waxed, armor straps tightened, weapons' edges tested with careful thumbs. Some men prayed quietly, their lips moving in the ancient words that had comforted warriors since time immemorial. Others simply waited, their eyes fixed on the road below where destiny would soon unfold. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the sky, the morning mist began to rise from the stream, just as Roderick had predicted. It rolled up the hillsides like a living thing, wrapping the hidden knights in a grey shroud that would make them invisible to the army now stirring in its distant camp. The trap was set. All that remained was for Duke Aldric to march his 50,000 men into the jaws of death. From his position high on the eastern slope, Duke Roderick raised his hand in the ancient signal his knights had been waiting for. In just a few hours, the medieval world would witness something that military scholars would debate for centuries: how 500 knights could ambush an army of 50,000 and live to tell the tale. The morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows through the valley as Duke Aldric's massive army began its methodical advance. The sound was overwhelming, a symphony of war that echoed off the hillsides. 50,000 pairs of boots struck the earth in rhythm, creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. The jingle of mail, the creak of leather, the snorting of horses, and the rumble of wagon wheels combined into a cacophony that announced their approach from miles away. Duke Aldric rode at the head of his column, resplendent in polished plate armor that caught the morning light like a mirror. His great warhorse, a massive destrier worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime, stepped proudly beneath him. Behind the Duke, his banners snapped in the breeze, the golden lion of his house roaring silently against a field of deep blue. This was power made manifest, the accumulated might of 3 duchies moving as one inexorable force. The vanguard entered the Valley of Thornwood, just as the morning mist reached its thickest. Visibility dropped to mere yards, transforming the familiar road into an alien landscape of grey shadows and muffled sounds. The lead scouts, experienced men who had ridden these paths for decades, pressed forward cautiously. Something felt wrong, though they could not put their finger on what exactly troubled them. The birds had fallen silent. Even the usual rustle of small animals in the underbrush had ceased. High above on the forested slopes, 500 knights waited with the patience of hunting cats. Each man controlled his breathing, forcing his heart to slow despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Their horses, trained for this moment, stood like statues, ears pricked forward but making no sound. The mist swirled around them, providing perfect concealment, while allowing glimpses of the massive army flowing through the valley below. Duke Roderick crouched behind a fallen oak, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Through the grey veil, he could make out the shapes of enemy soldiers, rank upon rank of them stretching back as far as the eye could see. The sight would have terrified most commanders, but Roderick felt only a cold satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The key to the ambush lay not just in surprise, but in timing. Roderick had studied the movements of large armies, understanding that their very size made them vulnerable in ways that smaller forces were not. A massive host like Aldric's could not simply stop and turn around when threatened. The momentum of 50,000 men and their supply trains created a kind of military inertia that could be exploited by those clever enough to recognize it. As more of the enemy column entered the valley, Roderick's knights began their final preparations. Crossbows were loaded with steel-tipped bolts designed to punch through mail and leather. Lances were lowered to the attack position, their points gleaming despite the mist. Swords loosened in their scabbards, ready to be drawn at a moment's notice. Each knight checked the position of his assigned target among the enemy ranks below. The beauty of the ambush plan lay in its simplicity. The 500 knights were divided into 10 groups of 50, each positioned at carefully calculated intervals along the valley slopes. When Roderick gave the signal, they would not charge as a single mass, but would strike in a coordinated series of attacks designed to create maximum chaos and confusion. The first wave would target the enemy's command structure, focusing on the banners and mounted officers who directed the massive army's movements. Without clear leadership, 50,000 men would become nothing more than a mob, dangerous but unfocused. The second wave would strike at the cavalry, using their crossbows to bring down horses and riders before they could organize a response. The final waves would hit the infantry formations, breaking their lines and scattering them into the mist, where individual combat would favor the superior training and equipment of Roderick's knights. Down in the valley, Duke Aldric raised his gauntleted hand to halt his column. Something about the oppressive silence and thick mist had finally penetrated his confidence. His war-hardened instincts, honed by decades of campaign and battle, were screaming warnings that his rational mind struggled to accept. An army of 50,000 had nothing to fear from any force that Duke Roderick could muster. The mathematics were indisputable, yet the mist seemed almost alive, pressing in from all sides and reducing the world to a grey bubble barely 20 yards across. His scouts had not reported back from their advanced positions, and the usual sounds of a countryside awakening to morning were conspicuously absent. Birds should be singing. Small animals should be rustling through the underbrush. Instead, there was only the labored breathing of men and horses and the soft whisper of mist moving through the trees. Aldric turned in his saddle, peering back at the endless column of his army. The sight should have been reassuring, thousands upon thousands of armed men stretching back through the valley like a great serpent of steel and leather. But somehow, in the grey shroud of morning fog, even this vast host seemed diminished, vulnerable in ways that defied logical explanation. His lieutenant, Sir Marcus the Steadfast, guided his horse alongside his commander. The man's scarred face bore the marks of 2 decades of warfare, and his eyes held the same unease that Roderick was feeling. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if he feared to break the unnatural silence that surrounded them. The unease spread through the ranks like a disease. Veteran soldiers who had faced charging cavalry and besieged castles found themselves jumping at shadows. Horses nickered nervously, their ears swiveling at sounds their riders could not hear. Even the great siege engines seemed to groan more loudly than usual, their wooden wheels protesting against the cobblestones with an almost human voice of complaint. Above them in the mist, Duke Roderick watched the enemy column with the focused intensity of a master craftsman examining his finest work. The moment was almost at hand. His knights were in position, their weapons ready, their horses gathering themselves for the charge that would echo through history. In just moments, the world would discover what happened when medieval warfare's most fundamental assumption, that numbers always triumph, met the cold reality of tactical genius and perfect execution. The morning mist swirled thicker, as if the very elements conspired to aid the ambush. And in that grey shroud, 500 knights prepared to prove that sometimes, in the brutal calculus of war, quality could indeed triumph over quantity in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The signal came not as a trumpet blast or war cry, but as a simple gesture, Duke Roderick raised his sword toward the grey sky, the blade catching what little light filtered through the mist. Along the slopes, 500 pairs of eyes saw that gleaming steel, and 500 hearts began to pound with the rhythm of impending battle. The first volley of crossbow bolts hissed through the morning air like deadly rain. Steel points found their marks with devastating precision, punching through mail shirts and leather jerkins as if they were made of parchment. Duke Aldric's bannermen, those proud nobles who rode at the front of the column displaying their heraldry, suddenly found themselves under attack from an enemy they could not see. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, bearer of the Golden Lion standard, felt the crossbow bolt take him in the chest before he heard the sound of its release. The impact lifted him from his saddle, his banner toppling into the mud as his warhorse reared in panic. Around him, other officers suffered the same fate, their voices crying out in shock and pain as the invisible enemy struck with surgical precision. The effect on the massive army was immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers who had been marching in perfect formation suddenly found themselves without officers, without orders, without any understanding of what was happening to them. The mist that had seemed merely inconvenient moments before now became a terrifying enemy in itself, hiding attackers who struck like ghosts and vanished just as quickly. Duke Aldric wheeled his destrier in a circle, his voice roaring commands that seemed to be swallowed by the grey shroud around him. But his words carried no further than a few yards. Lost in the chaos that was erupting throughout his column, men were shouting contradictory orders, horses were screaming as more bolts found their marks, and the tight discipline that had held 50,000 soldiers in formation began to dissolve like morning frost. The second wave of the ambush struck before the first had fully registered. From different sections of the slope, another 50 knights sent their bolts flying into the massed cavalry. These were not random shots, but carefully aimed strikes designed to bring down the enemy's mounted arm before it could organize a response. War horses crashed to the ground, their riders trapped beneath their weight or thrown clear to land hard on the cobblestones. Sir Marcus the Steadfast tried to rally his men, standing in his stirrups and waving his sword toward the hillsides where the attacks were coming from. His voice, trained by years of battlefield command, cut through the chaos like a blade. For a moment, it seemed as though his experience and authority might restore order to the confusion. Then a crossbow bolt took him in the throat, and his words dissolved into a gurgle of blood. Now came the moment that Duke Roderick had planned for months. As the enemy reeled from the crossbow volleys, as their command structure crumbled and their formations began to break apart, he gave the signal for the cavalry charge. His sword swept downward, and 500 knights spurred their horses into motion. The sound was like thunder rolling down from the hills. Hoofbeats pounded against earth and stone, creating a rhythm that seemed to shake the very air. Through the mist came the gleam of lance points, the flash of drawn swords, and the terrible beauty of heavy cavalry in full charge. These were not the massive destriers of tournament combat, but swift coursers bred for exactly this kind of warfare, their lighter frames allowing them to navigate the treacherous slope without losing momentum. Duke Aldric's army, already reeling from the crossbow attacks, now faced something that defied all military logic. Enemy cavalry was charging downhill into their ranks, but where was the rest of the enemy army? Where were the supporting infantry, the archers, the siege engines that should accompany such an assault? The mist hid the truth that these 500 knights were alone, that this impossible charge represented the entirety of Duke Roderick's force. The first impact was devastating. Knights with their lances in the couched position struck the disorganized enemy formations like a battering ram made of steel and horseflesh. Lance points found gaps in armor, punched through shields, and sent men flying backward into their comrades. The psychological effect was even greater than the physical damage, as soldiers who had never seen an uphill cavalry charge began to believe they were facing supernatural enemies. But Roderick had not planned for a single devastating charge, followed by a fighting withdrawal. His tactics were far more sophisticated than that. As the first wave of knights crashed into the enemy ranks, they immediately wheeled their horses and rode back up the slope, disappearing into the mist as quickly as they had emerged. To the confused soldiers below, it seemed as though the attackers had simply vanished into thin air. Before the enemy could recover from the first assault, the second wave struck from a completely different direction. 50 more knights charged down from the western slope, their war cries echoing off the valley walls as they crashed into the flank of Aldric's column. Again, the attack was devastatingly effective, scattering formations and adding to the growing panic that was spreading through the massive army like wildfire. Duke Aldric found himself in the nightmare position of every medieval commander, fighting an enemy he could not see, could not count, and could not predict. Each time his men tried to form defensive positions, another group of knights would emerge from the mist at a different point, strike hard, and vanish again before any organized response could be mounted. It was like trying to fight shadows, and the psychological toll on his army was becoming catastrophic. The genius of Roderick's plan was now becoming clear. By striking in waves from different positions, his 500 knights were creating the illusion of a much larger force. To the soldiers trapped in the valley, it seemed as though they were surrounded by thousands of enemies, that every hilltop concealed another formation of cavalry ready to charge. The mist that had initially favored the attackers was now working against the defenders, magnifying every sound, distorting every shadow, and turning imagination into the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. Panic began to spread through the ranks like a plague. Soldiers who had never shown cowardice in a dozen campaigns found themselves looking over their shoulders, jumping at every sound, seeing enemies in every shadow. The tight formations that were the backbone of medieval infantry began to loosen as men instinctively sought cover or pressed closer to their comrades for comfort. The supply trains, stretched out along miles of road behind the main army, became scenes of utter chaos. Teamsters abandoned their wagons and fled into the countryside. Horses broke free from their traces and galloped away in terror. Precious supplies, weapons, and equipment were scattered across the landscape as the support structure of the massive army collapsed under the psychological pressure of the invisible enemy. Yet Duke Aldric was no coward, and he was far from finished. Drawing on decades of experience, he began to adapt to this unprecedented situation. If he could not see his enemies clearly, if he could not predict where they would strike next, then he would have to change the nature of the battle itself. His voice rang out across the chaos, calling for his surviving officers to rally their men into defensive squares to prepare for a fighting withdrawal that would get his army out of this valley of death. But Roderick had anticipated this response as well. The final phase of his ambush was about to begin, and it would prove that even the most experienced commanders could be outmaneuvered when they faced an enemy who understood that in warfare, perception could be more powerful than reality, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from superior numbers, but from superior thinking. The moment Duke Aldric began organizing his defensive squares, Duke Roderick unleashed the most devastating phase of his ambush. From every direction simultaneously, all remaining knights charged down the slopes in a coordinated assault that shattered what little order remained in the massive army. The psychological impact was complete and catastrophic. Soldiers who had held their ground through the earlier attacks now broke and ran. The sight of enemy cavalry emerging from the mist on all sides created a terror so profound that discipline simply evaporated. Men threw down their weapons and fled toward the rear of the column, trampling their own comrades in their desperation to escape what seemed like an army of phantoms. The narrow confines of the valley worked against Aldric's forces in ways he had never anticipated. With 50,000 men packed into a space barely wide enough for the road and its immediate surroundings, there was nowhere to maneuver, nowhere to form proper battle lines. Knights found themselves trapped between their own infantry and supply wagons, unable to charge or even turn their horses effectively. In those few terrible hours at the Valley of Thornwood, Duke Roderick had shattered more than just an army. He had proven that the greatest weapon in medieval warfare was not the strength of steel or the weight of numbers, but the power of the human mind to see beyond conventional wisdom. His 500 knights had achieved something that would be studied by military strategists for centuries. They had turned the very foundations of medieval combat on their head through nothing more than tactical brilliance and perfect execution. The lesson echoes through history even today. Sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when courage meets cunning, and when leaders dare to rewrite the rules of war itself.